Which ancient culture was way more ducked up than most people know. What I always thought horrific was the imperial Chinese practice of 9 degrees. As in 9 degrees of relation. Say that someone seriously offends the emperor. The emperor then orders that not just that person, but everyone related to that person, within 9 degrees of relationship, is to be executed. Grandparents, parents, siblings, spouse, children, cousins, more cousins. Concubines and their children. Babies in the cradle, old people who were bedridden, all their household servants, probably their in-laws too. Later emperors were more humane, and simply executed the main offender, then sentenced all those people to exile, a forced death march of thousands of miles, where the few survivors had to eke out a living doing hard labor. Feudal China was super into burying people alive. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor responsible for the unification of China, upon his death, had 70,000 concubines, servants, and workers forcibly interred alongside him. The terracotta army was constructed only because murdering all the soldiers as well wasn't an option. The ancient Assyrians built a vast empire. The empire reached its height during the Neo-Assyrian era, from 911 BC to the fall of its largest city Nineveh in 612 BC. The Assyrian dominion, stretching from Egypt to modern-day Iraq, controlled richly diverse cultures. To quash any uprising in these conquered areas, Assyrian leaders utilized extreme violence. Their horrific campaigns were celebrated in stone reliefs festooning the palace walls. They created tablets containing every single punishment the Assyrian army carried out. They cut off the limbs, gouged out the eyes, and then left those poor victims to roam around. Those poor people serve as a living reminder of the Assyrians' cruelty. The Assyrians were proud of the mass executions. The victim's skin was hung on the city wall. The brutality of the Assyrians was extreme, even for the ancient standards of cruelty. The Incas, I'm Peruvian, and the national myth here is that the Inca Empire was paradise on earth until the evil Spaniards showed up. The Inca Empire killed its way through South America. The conquered only had 2 choices: be assimilated into the empire or be razed to the ground, Genghis Khan style. Sparta. People in general remember them as just being these super soldiers, but don't know how Spartan society was built on draconic slavery and institutional pedophilia. Sparta. Sparta has a reputation as no-nonsense people who dedicated their lives to become ultimate warriors. People know they were ruthless and had slaves, but the total depravity and sheer stupidity of Sparta eludes common knowledge. Sparta was an extremely oppressive state where a small elite enslaved 90+% of society and killed them for sport. But being in the elite wasn't much better. The education system was pure abuse and produced traumatized, close-minded men incapable of anything else except heaping the same brutality on the next generation. The elite Spartiate class was a closed class. You couldn't become one no matter of your services to Sparta, but it was possible to lose Spartiate status. The Spartiate class became smaller and smaller as the years went on, eventually becoming too weak to keep Sparta alive. And all this didn't even produce better soldiers. Spartan society was fueled entirely by slavery. Massive slave population, actual citizen force pretty small and useless at anything but soldiery. According to Aristotle, the Spartans knew full well the slaves could snap and revolt at any time, and they outnumbered the masters so hugely they could possibly win, so the Spartans had a policy of keeping their slaves constantly in fear. They even had a public holiday where they massacred slaves just to break their wills. Sparta. There is nothing about that culture that is worth emulating, but the movie 300 makes it seem cool. Movies make a lot of ideas seem cool. Look up what they did to the entire population of the Helot people. An entire nation of slaves. Spartan society was fueled entirely by slavery. Massive slave population, actual citizen force pretty small and useless at anything but soldiery. According to Aristotle, the Spartans knew full well the slaves could snap and revolt at any time, and they outnumbered the masters so hugely they could possibly win, so the Spartans had a policy of keep. The Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt were 10 generations bookended by 2 actually good leaders. Ptolemy and Cleopatra. Their family history would make for a fun trashy soap opera, full of backstabbing, femicide, and a truly appalling amount of incest, as they spent 200 years running Egypt into the ground. Too bad it was all real. And yes, Cleopatra was one of history's few inbreeding success stories. She managed to get all the best traits of her insane family, and none of the bad ones. If you've got a little time, listening to Blue at OSP lose his mind trying to describe the Ptolemaic kingdom is hilarious. Not necessarily ancient, but the Iroquois, they had many rituals of torture for prisoners of war, including ripping out fingernails/cutting off fingers, followed by forcing them to run the gauntlet, and then if they survived, they would be scalped and burned alive. The correct answer is that every group of human beings was by our current moral standards absolutely brutal. Nothing the Iroquois did here was unique or particularly worse than many other groups. I just haven't seen anyone mention them in this thread yet, so I figured I would. There are indications that the Merovingians had some pretty interesting burial practices. There have been excavations where they found people surrounded by multiple heads, indications that graves were set on fire, indications of immobilization of the dead, hand and feet bound, for example, etc. In most cases, the last example can be seen as merely a ritual thing, but in some cases excavators claim people were buried alive. There's also increasing evidence that these people reopened graves sometime after burial to take/bury/exchange body parts and objects, kind of like the saints cults that took off a bit later in the same regions. Again, it's not really doesn't harm living people, and I'm cautious about playing into the whole dark and violent Middle Ages thing, but it's definitely interesting and unexpected for most people. Especially since most high school classes depict the Merovingians as the first Christians in the region, and these practices definitely took place beyond Christianization in the area. Japan is largely sanitized to Westerners because most people just see them as that country we nuked. History doesn't really have good guys, but they basically never landed on being the lesser of two evils. We cannot bring up the atrocities of Japan without mentioning comfort women. The soldiers lined up to date them repeatedly each day, performed hysterectomies on them with no anesthetic when they inevitably got pregnant, tattooed their bodies, brutalized them on their whim, killed them in horrific ways for so much as verbalizing a desire to leave, forced the others at gunpoint to watch these prolonged executions and consume the bodies, killed them in horrific ways anyways just for fun. And to this day the Japanese government insists these women, estimated between 50,000 to 200,000 abducted women and young teenage girls, were volunteers. Why such a vast range? Well, when people are murdered for funsies, forced to cannibalize the dead, and prone to hurling themselves off cliffs, a ton of evidence is destroyed, and it gets really hard to narrow it down. Watched a documentary on YouTube about a Korean comfort woman. She was 15 and told she was going to work in a factory, which is why her mother encouraged her to go. When the doctors at the facility found out her age, they discussed whether she was too young for the work, but ultimately decided she was old enough to comfort the soldiers. She tried to kill herself by drinking an entire bottle of alcohol, but all it did was tear her stomach up. She was an adult by the time she finally got back to Korea. When she worked up the ability to tell her mother what happened, her mother had a heart attack. Like many comfort women, she doesn't want Japan's monetary compensation. She wants a sincere apology from the Japanese government acknowledging the harm they did to her and others, along with the statement admitting to falsely claiming they were all volunteers. A lot of Pacific cultures practiced cannibalism. Some still do in Papua New Guinea. But Maori here in New Zealand did in some tribes as well. So, the worst insult you can use in the Maori language, puko, means to boil your head. Harking back to when people were boiled and eaten. Genghis Khan and the Mongolians of the steppe were absolutely ruthless and efficient. Entire unknown civilizations are reportedly wiped out by them with zero trace of their culture intact, just fields of bones saying something big was there. There was at least one incident of a drunken Mongolian post-raid demanding a group of runaways remain still while he stumbled off to find his sword and kill them, and they did out of fear for what would happen had they not. There was an instance of a relatively small recon element of Mongolians who were sent over some mountains in IIRC modern-day Russian region just to see what over there, stumbled onto an entire joint nation army, and were said them all conquering the whole place. The Khans were hard people. Oddly enough though, they were relatively progressive for their time. Once your people were conquered, they didn't really care what you did spoke believed as long as you paid your tributes. They were even protected from outside raiders. It's just, the whole getting massacred and conquered part to deal with. Source, Dan Carlin's Hardcore History Podcast, Wrath of the Khans, and Memory. *, there was one instance of their unique brutalism that came back to mind. So being the progressive conquerors they were, they pretty regularly honored the beliefs and gods of their enemies. In one such instance they'd sacked and captured a host of nobles who believed it was unholy to spill high blood. In response, the Mongolians decided to honor their traditions, and rather than cut them to pieces, they laid the nobles flat, built a dance floor on top of them, and partied like hell while the nobles were crushed underneath. No blood was spilled. The Spanish were able to recruit the help of many other people groups when overthrowing the Aztecs, because they were so hated by the people they subjugated. They often used these subjugated people groups practically as livestock, collecting large numbers of them to be ritually sacrificed to their gods in incredibly barbaric ways, ripping out their beating hearts while they were alive, skinning them, and other such acts. Other sacrifices, such as for the dedication of temples, involved extremely high volumes of sacrifices and appear to have been done by beheading the victims. The dedication of the Pyramid Temple at Tenochtitlan in 1486 involved the sacrifice of 80,400 prisoners over the course of 4 days. At that pace, 15 victims would have to be killed per minute. Lower estimates place the number of sacrificed victims at 10,000. For altars were set up at the top of the pyramid to carry out multiple simultaneous sacrifices facing each of the sides of the pyramid, with the victims' bodies being tossed down the sides of the pyramid as human blood ran down its steps. They sacrificed children to their rain god every year to ensure that they would keep getting rain. The tears of the children were thought to bring the rain, so they would torture the children ahead of sacrificing them to their rain god Tlaloc to make them shed as many tears as possible. Samurai and feudal Japan. People like to imagine the samurai as some kind of noble order built around the belief that honor and service were to be held above all. Samurai didn't give half a sideways about the common peasant. They were a blue-blood aristocracy that used their power and training to perpetuate a totalitarian regime that would make the House of Windsor blush. 10 million Africans died under the reign of King Leopold II of Belgium. Absolute horrific brutality. He belongs in the same category as Hitler, Stalin, and Pol Pot. Sorry, not very ancient, but his name doesn't come up in these discussions enough. Ancient Greece. A lot of people imagine clean villas, people with white togas talking about arts and philosophy all day. The truth is that most people were dirt poor, being born disabled, or being born a girl, could be a death sentence, and pedophilia was rampant among the rich. Also a lot of their economy was based on slavery. Funnily enough, the Persian Empire was actually better than it was portrayed. It was extremely open to different religions and were very advanced in civil liberty. When you really look at it, the Greeks were kinda the baddies in the wars between these empires. Even Alexander basically said that after conquering Persia. But because we get a lot of our information about the classic period by Greek and Roman writers, Persia was seen as a barbaric tyrannical state. The Habsburg dynasty in Spain used to breed with their own family to keep the bloodline pure. It ended with reign of Charles II, who was so inbred that he had black testicles and several developmental disorders. He was unable to have any kids, which led to the end of the Habsburgs in Spain. Aztecs. Priests would sacrifice hundreds of people, slaves, and prisoners of war. Rip the chest open and pull their still pumping heart out. Throw the bodies down the steps. Channels were carved into the pyramid faces to let liters and liters of blood flow down. Horrible stuff. Aztecs were pretty messed up, but Babylonia? They are left behind whole walls of sculpture depicting how many hundreds of thousands they killed for sport. I'm quite sure it was worse when Neanderthals walked amongst us, but no written record. Aztec and other Mesoamerican civilizations routinely executed, i.e., sacrificed, innocent people for no other reason than to please their gods. By some estimates, the Aztecs sacrificed 250,000 people annually. They'd cut still conscious people's hearts out of their rib cages, chop off their heads, and throw their lifeless bodies down the steps of their temples in front of crowds of onlookers. Brutal. But hey, it was just their culture. All of them. Man, if you realized just how utterly bloodthirsty our history is, you'd huddle in the corner and cry, as someone came over and slit your throat in praise of their voodoo sky daddy /for rain /for funsies because they were ordered to. Life is cheap. It's also so expensive, so meaningful, so precious. Look at all the conditions that had to be perfect just to sustain life. And here we are, killing each other not for sustenance or self-defense. Oh no, it's for stupid reasons. Completely oblivious to just how utterly rare our existence is. And the worst part, we're not that much better than those who willy-nilly murdered each other hundreds and thousands of years ago. Case in point, look at what a failed disgruntled artist did in Germany in the 1930-1940s. We still have ruthless extinguishing of life, even today. And yet, we could be so much more. We're almost there to the point where we are civilized. Where people don't need to suffer and die needlessly. Yet, the conditions are right for it'll get worse before it gets better. There are too many powerful, rich people who control way too much, who'll watch the world burn before they accept less profit or give up control over their workers/indentured servants. For the first time in human history, we're the closest we've ever been to any concept of a utopia. And we laugh at it and keep doing what we've always done. If I were alien life observing Earth, I'd do my elfin darndest to make sure those Earthlings never spread out among the stars. When I was watching Castlevania, I did some research where the Dracula myth comes from and stumbled upon Vlad Tepes' Dracula, or by his nickname called Vlad the Impaler. They are not sure about the numbers, but you have to impale a lot of people to get that nickname. A lot of people view the First Nations in North America as peaceful environmentalists before white people showed up. In reality, they were the same as any continent with many different nations. There was genocide, slavery, torture, cannibalistic rituals, and everything else that goes wrong when people don't like each other. They would also kill entire herds of animals, and overhunt and harvest from the land. If they had more advanced technology, they would have done everything white people did. Once white people did show up, they instantly saw the technological advantages and began trading for guns and weapons to wage war against other nations better. Just as a relatively recent example, in 1649, the 5 nations of the Iroquois defeated, and almost wiped out, the Huron Confederacy. The surviving Hurons had to flee. Some joined the French, where there are still only few of them today, and some fled to Oklahoma. Ancient or not, British colonization and atrocities in India is responsible for the deaths of at least 100 million people. Aside from blatant atrocities and slaughter, people actually had to guard their families from neighbors who turned cannibalistic due to starvation. British atrocities are largely not discussed, with no admittance of these atrocities or mention of reparation. People have glorified samurai as some kind of spiritual warriors, and while that may be true for some famous ronin, samurai were often bloodthirsty killers. It was common that when 2 clans would clash, the victor would kill all remaining members of the defeated family, including small children. The Mayan civilization from 100 BC to 33 AD. Sacrificing children by placing them on red-hot idols. Feeding husbands to their surviving children and spouses. Tossing believers in God into burn pits. Parents tossing infants into a raging river that went through a cave. If blood came out the other side, then the gods accepted the sacrifice. The list goes on and on and on. North American indigenous groups often enslaved war captives, whom they primarily used for small-scale labor. Others, however, would stake themselves in gambling situations when they had nothing else, which would put them into servitude for a brief time, or in some cases for life. Captives were also sometimes tortured as part of religious rites, which sometimes involved ritual cannibalism. During times of famine, some North American indigenous would also temporarily sell their children to obtain food. Belgium under Leopold II was a menace. The Belgians turned what was a Congo Free State into the private property of King Leopold. For 30 years he ruthlessly extracted ivory, rubber, and minerals from the Congo Basin. Failure to meet quotas resulted in death. Imagine losing a hand because you couldn't find rubber. In order to prove someone had been killed, the hand was collected. In time, the collection of hands became an end in itself. I saw a photo from 1904 of a man staring at the severed hand and foot of his 5-year-old daughter. OMG. Estimate of total deaths range between 5 to 10 million over the course of 20-plus years, 1885 to 1908, that's almost half the region's population. The ancient Celtic and Germanic people would ritually sacrifice people in 3 diverse ways. It's called the triple death. They would strangle you, stab you, and bank you on the head, and then throw you in a peat bog. They believed these bogs were in some way connected to the spiritual world. Turns out that these bogs in these regions provide a near-perfect environment to preserve flesh for hundreds of years. We have recovered many bodies from them in a condition which allows an autopsy and further study. The overwhelming majority of them show more than one cause of death and are mostly young people in their 20s that had smooth hands, meaning they were probably important, maybe royalty or druids/seers. The Maori, the indigenous people of New Zealand, were cannibals. A warlike people in constant armed conflict with their neighbors, other tribes. They were feared. And this is not surprising. Those who were defeated suffered a terrible fate. They were killed, sometimes very cruelly, and eaten. It was believed that in this way the warriors acquired the strength, dexterity, and knowledge of the fallen. The Inca were despised by their neighbors. Think about this, why would the Inca sacrifice their own children? They wouldn't, so they kidnapped children from surrounding lesser tribes. When the Spanish came, these same tribes allied with the Spanish, a lesser evil, to take down the Inca. Edit, I am not saying the Spanish were some great liberators, I'm not even saying there is good or bad involved, the real world is much more nuanced than that. All it was a greater civilization demolishing an inferior one, then exploiting and abusing the inferior people. Much like the Inca were doing to their neighbors. The Inca being the greater civilization that exploited and abused their lesser neighbors, lesser tribes, and lesser communities that bordered them. To me this isn't good or bad, that was just the way the world was back then. Native American tribes. There's this weird belief that younger generations have that Native Americans were all hippies and rainbows and conveniently leave out the tribe slaughtering, raping, pillaging, sacrifice, etc. The oh-so-enlightened Athenians were brutal slavers and rapists. Women were at best second-class citizens, but more commonly treated as property. It was normal to marry at 15, and after being sent out it was likely a woman would not see their mother again. They were cloistered in separate rooms and required a male guardian to be seen in public. They could be beaten without recompense. The Republic of Athens ran off of slavery. Every citizen had slaves. Even the most enlightened of philosophers didn't think twice about the institution. If you were a slave you could be worked to death and punished for nothing. Life for most people who lived in Athens at various points in its existence was barbarous, and the great architectural achievements we admire them so much for were vanity projects funded by them plundering their allies. Mayans. For the longest time Westerners had this whole noble savage mythology around them. Peaceful. Living with nature. Victims of Spanish colonization. In California during elementary school, we had to learn about the California missions. Basically, we were taught that the natives and the Spanish were happily existing together, but that was definitely not the case. In reality, it was straight-up forced assimilation. Rome was a lot more ducked than people give it credit for. Some of the legal punishments were being fed to lions was not the worst of it, you could get sentenced to death by a large animal. They had a caste of castrated priests of Sibyl. A goddess they got from Anatolia after the initial losses in the Second Punic War. They were legalistic, everything had to be seen as legal even if it maybe wasn't quiet. Women were named after their dad and a number. The father of the household had the legal right to kill anyone in his family. Taxation was handled through auctions. You bid for the right to collect taxes in the provinces, corruption was the expected method you used to earn back what you invested. Athenian democracy was pretty ducked up too. I read somewhere once that there was a discrepancy in grain counts, and they started executing merchants one by one on the vote of the city until it was discovered someone had made an accounting error. Also, for anyone posting. Ancient history is anything before roughly the 5-6th century CE, late antiquity. This includes classical antiquity, ancient Egypt, the Xia dynasty, Hammurabi's code, Hellenic civilization, Romans, Phoenicians, development of written language, the Babylonian Empire, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, pretty much up to the foundation of Islam. Anything after that until the 15th century is considered post-classical. That includes medieval period, the Dark Ages, the Islamic Golden Age, the Mongol expansion, the Aztec Empire, etc. Anything after the 15th century modern history includes early modern, Renaissance, Reformation, Age of Discovery, etc., late modern, Enlightenment, Industrial Revolution, rise of the nation-state, and contemporary, anything post-World War II. One thing I remember reading about is how ancient Incans would take young girls, like 8 to 14 years old, hike them up to the top of the Andes, and clobber them over the head with an obsidian-spiked club as a sacrifice to some kind of god. The temperatures at that altitude are so cold that the bodies were frozen and perfectly preserved for hundreds of years, and that's how we found out about this brutal practice. The act is not like some other stuff in this thread, like the ancient Assyrians, but there's something about how they hike to the top of a massive mountain to their deaths that is chilling. Athens. If you're familiar with The Handmaid's Tale, then you can imagine what life was like in ancient Athens. Women had absolutely zero rights, autonomy, or freedoms. Social status was based completely on her ability to bear male heirs. Their work was weaving, cooking, and other domestic duties. Loads of Athenian households had slaves to help with domestic duties, but those slaves were often also women. Male slaves tended to be laborers, farmhands, miners, loggers, etc. Spartans. Man, they were so insane that all the other insane Greek civics thought they were just joking. They enslaved a whole faction of Greek people that baffled even the slave-holding Persians and Greeks. What they did to their kids, how woman was valued. It was lunacy. There's so much more. Everyone who was around back then couldn't believe it. The Aztecs were kind of far worse than most realized. The people of the Aztec Empire weren't as supportive of it as one might think. Much of what made up its empire were conquered kingdoms, in other words unwilling participants to Mr. Bones' wild ride. One of the kingdoms was drawn into the war after the Aztec kings promised to marry their monarch's daughter, where he then lured her away, skinned her alive, and then met with the king wearing her still juicy skin as a cloak, in which he essentially said psych. And then proceeded to conquer most if not all Mesoamerica very ruthlessly and violently. Their conquest finally being quite famously and ironically cut short by a foreign empire, Spain. With that being said, it's wrong to compare the crimes of one state to another, as both are just as morally bereft for the conception of a conquest, but it would be amiss to not at least mention that the Spanish colonizers were worse in some ways whilst the Aztecs were worse in others. I feel I should also conclude with this doesn't make what the conquistadors did right, they are just as bad. It is just kind of ironic that they got the treatment so eloquently defined by Kagun Jin, there's always a bigger fish. I am white, so anything said here doesn't really pertain to the indigenous people and is more of an outside view of the matter, news, social class, etc. Also, my memory isn't the greatest, so please don't blame me for getting something wrong. That being said, corrections and added info are highly appreciated. For those outside of North America, Canada introduced the Indian Act in 1876 to lay out the laws for First Nations in Canada. This basically told the indigenous people that white people could do whatever they wanted to them, and if they stood up for themselves, they would be punished. Residential schools were introduced too as a way to try and teach European culture to indigenous children. However, many kids were taken away from their parents and abused, beaten, and even killed in these schools. It took until the 50s or 60s for the government to realize, oh, this isn't right, and started to attempt to make amends with the First Nations. However, through all of it, everything from the Indian Act to now, the indigenous population was never consulted. Thankfully, the last residential school was shut down in 1996 in Saskatchewan, and things do seem to be getting better, but crimes against indigenous people, mainly missing and murdered indigenous women and girls, are still somehow major problems up here. Rome deforested Europe with their baths. But also, their empire was specifically designed to go out with legions to conquer slaves. They paid soldiers and senators with the land they took from the slaves. Julius Caesar killed 1 million Celts living in France and Germany areas and forced them to the British Isles. Legions were the worst. The Aztec civilization, while known for its advancements in art, architecture, and agriculture, also practiced human sacrifice as part of their religious rituals. These sacrifices involved significant cruelty and brutality. When the husband dies, the wife has to be burned alive with the husband's corpse. Usually when wives are young, not even in their 20s. Guys would just marry another girl in case the wife dies, and in most cases, the husband would be super old, and the wife would be super young. This is a serious culture which used to exist in Nepal, a small country in the middle of India and China. Sati culture in Hindu community of India and Nepal was lasted until couple centuries ago. For those who don't know, the culture meant that whenever a man dies, his wife would be burned alive with his dead body. It's already horrendous, but the thing that makes it even more scary is that it was quite common for a man to have multiple wives, and there always used to be huge age gap between a man and his wives. The tribe that lived in Machu Picchu did a lot of sacrifices for the sake of the tribe, and at some time, the oldest of the tribe was 17 years old, and the youngest was something like 5 years old. A guide explained this to my mother when she was there, so I can't be 100% sure of the age range, but it was something around for sure. I can't find a concrete source either, so maybe it was just a lie to make the trip interesting, but if it's true, that's pretty ***** CK up to me. Pre-Islamic Arabia used to bury their daughters alive cause they were ashamed to have daughters and only wanted sons. The Roman Empire. People boast about the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire is the reason bears are no longer in Africa. Look up the Atlas bear. The Roman Empire also killed off numerous other species and subspecies, including the Barbary lion, the European lion, and many others. I'm not saying the Roman Empire was small, but I wish people would stop endlessly boasting about them like they were some sort of gods. They weren't. They were horrible. Tibet was far from the non-violent, spiritually enlightened society most people believe. It was deeply entrenched in violence and slavery. Sources might be a bit difficult to get due to overwhelming anti-China rhetoric, but The Guardian is as Western liberal as it gets. Canaanites would dash the heads in of enemy babies on walls by swinging them against the wall by their feet and piling the bodies for all to see. The idea of shock and awe where we get the phrase dashing. They also engaged in bestiality, incest, and depraved evil acts so awful that the animals, babies, and all the people were to be wiped off the face of the earth as they could not be healed. Every livestock animal. It took 400 years of performing acts of evil to get to that point. I am not a better person for having read some of their history. The Aztecs are maybe the worst civilization to ever have existed. Their entire culture was based around war and farming. When they went to war, they wouldn't try to kill combatants. Instead, they would take as many prisoners as they could to use for human sacrifices to their gods. Victims had their hearts cut out or were decapitated, shot full of arrows, clawed, sliced, stoned, crushed, skinned, buried alive or tossed from the tops of temples. The Aztecs would also ask for tribute of children from their subjects for these sacrifices because their leaders believed that the unspoiled nature of a child would be a more pleasing sacrifice to the gods. And to make it worse, it was considered a good omen if they cried at the time of death, so the sacrifices would torture them to ensure that they did. And to add to all of this, the Aztecs would also cannibalize the corpses. It is worth noting though that while we know the sacrificial culture was widespread, it is less certain how common cannibalism was. There is a reason that thousands of indigenous peoples within the Aztec polity asked Cortés to liberate them from Aztec rule when he landed with the Spanish expedition. The Spartans. I mean, the Athenians weren't exactly a race of philosopher kings, but the Spartans were something else. One of the reasons they so rarely took their legendary combat skills to the actual battlefield was that they were so outnumbered by their slave class that they were afraid to deploy troops away from Sparta for fear of slave uprisings. The Phoenicians, my ancestors, and Canaanites used to sacrifice their children and babies by fire to the god Moloch/Baal, a man with a bull's head, the precursors of the ideas of the devil and hell. The ancient name of hell is Gehinnom, which means Valley of Hinnom, where the sacrifices took place. You can look this up on Wikipedia using the keywords Valley of Hinnom, Tophet, and Moloch. Spartans. People praise them, but in reality they were unhygienic, incestuous, murdering, slaving, useless rapist pedophiles. The only thing they knew how to do well was fighting, and even that was the earlier ones. In their culture, working was seen as something for lesser people. Their slaves would work and produce things, and the Spartans would just leech off of them. The Hebrew people in the Bible that used to stone women when they were caught sleeping with another man. The Aztecs. Started as 3 smallish tribes that eventually grew to take over a huge portion of South America. They were like the Galactic Empire. Everybody cowered in fear of them. They had a stronger military than almost any of the smaller tribes around them and ruled as complete tyrants and dictators, and literally had a blood god that demanded blood. The amount of people they sacrificed wasn't just a few dozen a year or something, it was around 250,000 people a year. Every year. In fact, on one fateful day they cut out the hearts of over 20,000 people in a single day to commemorate finishing one of their grand pyramids. The victims were always people that were kidnapped and forcibly brought back to their capital city to be publicly dismembered, often getting cut into and dug around inside while fully alive and conscious. I've actually seen a cartel video where they did that to somebody, and it's absolutely horrific seeing somebody squirm around while they're getting their chest cavity sliced open. The Aztecs did this to about 25 million humans. I say this so as to fully depict true savagery. It sounds pretty tame when you just say, ritual sacrifice. It's said that the entire city just reeked of blood and rotting flesh for months after this mass torture/execution. They even spread the blood all over their buildings, houses, and crops for good luck/blessings. So, the entire city of Tenochtitlan just smelled absolutely rancid and insidious. A graveyard with a daily supply of fresh and rotten corpses, but also about 300,000 people just living their lives there. The Japanese, there is this clean persona now, but the medical research they did during World War II was some next level. Not to mention their practice of using paus packed into shipping vessels as meat shields. But culturally they took Buddhism even too far, creating a process to reach nirvana while still alive, and you are essentially mummifying yourself before you die. Also, Jesus ended up there and didn't die, that was his brother. The Ottoman Empire practiced something called the devshirme system, a practice of rounding up 8 to 12-year-old boys from Orthodox Christian villages and forcefully enslaving them into the elite Janissary corps. This practice started during the rule of Murad I, 1362–1389, and continued for centuries until Mahmud II abolished them in the Auspicious Incident, 1826. The Janissaries were once a professional army, specialized in archery, early firearms, and martial discipline. They were one of Europe's first standing armies. One Janissary wrote in their memoirs that the Europeans called the practice the 1 in 10, meaning the Ottomans took 1 in 10 boys, however the Janissary stated it was closer to 1 in 50. The Ottomans were strict as to who they took. Tall boys were excluded for being too stupid, short boys for being troublemakers, Hungarians and Croatians for being too close to the Habsburgs and disloyal, Armenians for being too close to the Persians and disloyal. This barbaric practice saw success on the battlefield in instances like Calderon, 1514, Constantinople, 1453, Second Belgrade, 1521, Rhodes, 1522, Varna, 1444, and many, many others. However, after the death of Suleiman I, ruled 1520–1566, widely regarded as one of the best sultans, the corps became corrupt and bloated. It inflated greatly by 1600, and became a class of tradesmen and free thinkers rather than an elite corps. They lost notoriety throughout Europe to armies like the Spanish, Dutch, French, and Swedish. In the 18th century, Selim III established the Nizam-i-Sedid army, designed to replace the Janissaries. This saw success in the Battle of Akka, 1800, where Cesar Ahmed Pasha defeated Napoleon. However, the disloyalty of the Janissaries caused Selim to be overthrown in 1806, replacing him with Mustafa IV. Mustafa lasted less than a year and was replaced by Mahmud II in 1807. Mahmud was a serious reformer and began working on dismembering the Janissaries. In 1826, after announcing the creation of a new army, he prepared defenses in Constantinople, ready for the Janissaries to revolt. As they did, many civilians turned on the Janissaries. The new cavalry corps built by Mahmud obliterated the Janissaries, and the Janissary headquarters was burned. This became known as the Auspicious Incident. The practice came back to bite the Ottomans, contributing to their stagnation in the 1600s to 1700s and their eventual decline, beginning around Küküt Kaynarca in 1774. Prolonged peace from the 1750s to 1760s saw the Ottoman army cease all modernizing for 2 decades, a time in which Europe had a quickly evolving military doctrine due to the 7 Years' War. What's always cooked my noodle is imagining all of the horrible, awful, no good stuff that went down before recorded history. The most ancient civilization we have information on, as far as I know, is the Sumerians. Also, supposedly the Egyptians are dated as far back as well. 4000 BC. So, 6,000 years ago. That's all we've got of recorded human history. 6,000 years. Humans have been around for way longer than 6,000 years. The first modern humans, or Homo sapiens, date back 200,000 years. That's 33x as long as recorded human civilization. Imagine the type of that went down. It wasn't just a bunch of random monkeys looking at people hanging out by themselves. They absolutely got banded up into tribes, and they went to war with each other. They could have built entire civilizations and burnt them down repeatedly. 200,000 years is a lot of years to get up to shenanigans, And it's completely lost to time. Just, poof. Gone. As if it never happened. Which is honestly what will happen to all human endeavors.